Hey kids, History Channel guy here. So, what if I were to tell you that the Revolutionary War can't trace its roots back to New England, and instead it started in my home state of North Carolina? Well, you'd probably just say that I'm crazy and I'm being a North Carolina homer. Well, in today's quick history, I will let you decide for yourself when I go over the Regulator Movement, the unknown catalyst of the Revolutionary War. For those who are unaware, North Carolina was one of America's 13 original colonies. Though not as widely talked about as Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, North Carolina had a huge impact on the United States becoming independent. Though some would argue that the Battle of Guilford Courthouse is North Carolina's greatest contribution, I would argue the Regulator Movement was NC's greatest impact. The year is 1764, and British tyranny across the colonies were at all-time highs. In rural North Carolina, local residents believed that the British were taking advantage of them, namely in excessive taxes, falsified records, and excessive fees, the most incredible of which were an unfair land tax. According to British law, all land would be taxed at the same rate. This meant that less productive land, primarily found in western North Carolina near the Appalachian Mountains, was taxed at the same rate as fertile land in the east, which could be used to plant cash crops such as tobacco. This policy not only led to an already impoverished region of the colony to be poorer, but it created deep mistrust for the local governments, as most colonial officials were located in eastern North Carolina. Many of you may not know this, but Edenton and New Bern, two coastal cities, were the capitals in North Carolina at this time, not Raleigh, which is located in the middle of the state. In other words, the coastal elite held all the power, and the West wanted more rights. Initially, the regulators held peaceful demonstrations, led by men such as James Hunter and Herman Husband. The regulators' protests soon turned violent, though. Initially, the protests occurred in places such as Granville County, and the targets were unelected government officials appointed by the Crown, such as local sheriffs, tax collectors, and judges. Unrest only grew more when in 1765, North Carolina got a new governor in William Tyrone, who was a retired army colonel who claimed that he would quash the uprising. To make matters worse, Tyrone inhabited the beautiful governor's mansion located in New Bern, North Carolina, which was paid for with taxpayer dollars and was eventually called Tyrone's Palace by political opponents. Due to how vast North Carolina was and how the regulators were predominantly in the western part of the state, the movement went on for years. For instance, in 1770, 5 years after the regulator movement technically started, a mob seized a corrupt local official named Edmund Fanning, who previously committed fraud against the people of Orange County. Fanning was swiftly taken by the mob, where he was dragged down the stairs with his head hitting each step. While this was occurring, other protesters started throwing his personal possessions out the window and burning them. Obviously, this deeply concerned local officials, and as a result, Governor Tyrone rounded up the state militia who would march from New Bern to western North Carolina. Upon arrival, the regulators attempted to parley with Tyrone's forces, but instead of parleying, the governor simply told them that they had 1 hour to lay down their arms, or they'll be fired upon. Some accounts say 2 hours, but I like the 1 hour narrative better. Instead of backing down, the North Carolinians declared fire and be damned. The Battle of Alamance soon took place, and unfortunately, the regulators lost. Most of this can be attributed to Tyrone basically shooting at them right away after the parley was over. Despite causing him headaches, Governor Tyrone actually offered a pardon for most of the regulators if they swore an oath of allegiance to the royal government. With a few exceptions, most of them took the governor's offer, and by the end, over 6,000 regulators swore an oath to the British crown. Ironically, just a few years later, many of these men would take up arms against the British during the Revolutionary War. So, I guess that oath didn't work. Despite the governor's deal and approval from the British crown, North Carolina's colonial legislature was against giving amnesty to the regulators. But by then, most of the original regulator leaders were either dead, in exile, or hiding. So, what the colonial legislature wanted to do didn't really matter. However, what did matter was the news of the regulator movement was spreading across the country. Many newspapers, especially those in the Northeast, started to investigate the regulators and came to the conclusion that they were just really patriots fighting against the British tyranny. To these newsmen, the British were oppressing the Western North Carolinians, and they violated their British rights by destroying their movement via military means. In hindsight, this is kind of hilarious, considering the regulators literally used terrorist tactics to get what they wanted, but I digress. I guess killing local government officials and throwing them against the stairs is patriotic. But I will also acknowledge that Governor Tyrone broke the parley and started an artillery fire on the regulators immediately after negotiations stopped. So there was some fault there. Myself and other historians are of the opinion that the regulator movement was a huge catalyst for starting the American Revolution, but others, such as historian Joseph Spencer Bassett, interprets the regulator movement as not an American-style revolution, and instead as a way of preserving the current colonial government. Bassett wrote, "The regulators did not wish to change the form or principle of their government, but simply wanted to make the colony's political process more equal. They wanted better economic conditions for everyone, instead of a system that heavily benefited the colonial officials and their network of plantation owners, mainly near the coast." Bassett goes on to call the regulator movement, quote, "a peasants' rising, a popular upheaval." But what do you think? Is the regulator movement as important as I believe it is, or am I just being a North Carolina homer? Are there other smaller, lesser known movements in American history which led to the Revolutionary War that I'm missing? As always, remember to like and subscribe if you want more content, guys. Thanks, everyone.